Brother Tyler, invite the guests into the lodge and leave that door open so others can join us in our discussion this evening. Welcome to another episode of Follow Me. We are your lovely hosts, Worship Brother Wiley Forrester, and I'm Worship Brother Will Moore. Tonight's episode is brought to you by
friendship and brotherly love, because without them, no true Mason exists.
Amen.
So, we'd like to welcome everybody into our show tonight. We got a great audience tonight. Looks like we're probably 35 deep already, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Freemasonry and the Great Depression. It's a situation in time. Unfortunately, it's eerily similar to what we're facing now, with a lot of things that are going on in the world. But what I've learned through research, and you've obviously learned through research too, is how Masons respond during the time of crisis.
Yep.
Normally, after World War I, we had a major increase in membership. Same thing happened after all the other wars that took place. But also, the Depression brought about something different, and it was a huge drop in membership, and we'll talk about those numbers a little later. But the thing we want to say first is it's a long, there's so much history involved with Masonry during this time period, and we're focusing between the years 1929 to 1933.
Right.
Now, there is no Grand Lodge Proceedings of 1933 that I can find. I don't have them, which is one of the few that I don't have. So we can do a lot of research based on that. But so we took from 29 to 1934, and y'all know in the last episode we talked about Grandmaster Daniel, who had not been Grandmaster Daniel yet. So in 1929 he was Grandmaster, and of course the Great Depression happened beginning after our Grand Lodge, or right prior to our Grand Lodge session in 1929. Yeah. So we're going to dive into some of those. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us as usual. Remember to hit the like button, the subscribe button if you hadn't already, and
that little bell beside it too. You'll get reminders of when we're trying to do something fun.
And pass it along to others. We'd like to see this crowd grow to 100 or so in a forum. One of these meetings. We hope we're getting close to going back to lodge. We don't know. The governor came out today and said that bars and nightclubs and things like that are still to remain sheltered or shut until end of May, same as our lodges. We don't know where this is going, and we don't, the Grandmaster's got some tough decisions to make in the upcoming weeks, and I'm sure that he will take care of all of that for us.
And he's going to make the right call for the fraternity, and
absolutely.
I know it's even if it's a call we don't like, we know he's going to do what's right. And brethren, on tonight's topic, there is so much information out there that Wiley and I have both researched over the past several days. We could actually we could do a 10-part mini-series on this. We could literally fill up hours of time, because there's so much that went on during the Great Depression. As a lot of you history buffs know, and I'm not a big history buff, as I said before, but I found a lot of this very interesting, what happened through the Great Depression and the numbers that we lost through non-payment of dues, and we'll go into some of that, and just the ramifications of what the Great Depression had on not only the Grand Lodge of Georgia, our jurisdiction, but other jurisdictions around the country and around the world, because this was a worldwide phenomenon.
Correct.
Similar to what's going on with COVID-19 right now. So let's dive into a little bit of history, and just to give you the time frame we'll be working in, August 1929 through March of 1933 is basically what they classify as the Great Depression.
And of course, now we know that the ramifications from the Great Depression extended far beyond that. It went into all the way to 1939.
Right.
And for Masonic membership, the numbers never upticked again until 1941. So you think about, there was a 11 or 12 year span of just overall despair in the United States and in the world. So,
and just to give a point of reference, back in 1929, there were almost 3.3 million Masons in the U.S.
Yeah.
From through 1933 or 1938, I think it was, they declined almost. We lost over 800,000 Masons during that almost 10-year time frame. But in the time frame that we're focusing on, 29 through 33, we lost 394,000 Masons in the U.S.
Wow.
That's over 10% just in that short 5-year time frame, 4-year time frame.
And we know that the stock market crashed in October, on the 24th day of October, 1929. It sent Wall Street to a panic. Now, what people don't realize about that particular chain of events over 5 weeks, and it was a real interesting feat that I looked at over a point of 5 weeks. In the first day, the stock market lost 11%. Okay, and because the market was so loosely monitored,
right? There were no curbs in place. That
right,
time
and there was nobody, no securities commission to look after. So if you think about that, 11% in one day, but until the end of, I would say before Thanksgiving, the stock market had lost 33% in a matter of 4 weeks.
Now, to give you an idea of the numbers we're talking about, the Dow Jones numbers are, what are they, 4,000 or something like that?
I don't know. I don't have enough money to play stock market, so it doesn't really matter.
And someone who knows better I could look him up, but back in these days, the Dow Jones number was only 290.
Right.
So you got to think about how small the number was in comparison to today. And when you lose a third of that, you're talking a huge chunk of the market. Imagine today's numbers. Let's say it's 3,000. If we lost 1,000 points of that, how huge that would be. These are the kind of numbers they're talking about that back then.
And here's a cool fact is, like today, when we went through the things that we went through over the last 8 weeks, consumer spending has been in the tank, right? Mm-hmm. Consumer spending dropped 20% in 4 weeks. 20%. The amount of money these speculators and investors were putting in there, they lost more money, twice as much money in that time frame than was in circulation at that time.
That's
hard cash.
Well, and that's the scary thing. They were, it was like it is today, more phony money, more fake. And I can't say ones and zeros because they didn't have computers, but there was more stuff written on paper than there was to back it up anywhere.
Correct. Because it was so loosely monitored.
Right.
So when you look back at that, and you look at another aspect, at that time in 1929, we were taking in immigrants left and right because the country was forged, the Industrial Revolution is going on. We were taking in all these immigrants, right? So the president at that time said, "Whoa, we gotta stop immigration. If you can't take care of yourself and you're not self-sufficient when you come here, I'm sorry, but we're not gonna be able to let you come in."
Yeah, if you were going to come in as a burden, you did not get a visa. Which, if we tried that today, people would be standing on their heads screaming. But at that point in that day and time, they just were done. You can't come in if you're going to be any kind of burden on the U.S.
Because they didn't want you to become a product of the state at that time.
Right. And couldn't afford it.
And they couldn't afford to feed you. So I see all our investors are popping up what the Dow's doing today.
Well, and, back then, not only did it hit the U.S. hard, because our stock market tanked, that rippled throughout the world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
People didn't think about it as much back then as they do now, but everything was still so tied together that when our money went down, everybody else's money went down, and it caused recession around the globe.
Just think about this number. We loaned all the European powers money for the military from World War One. Mm-hmm. Well, now it was time to call the loans because we were going broke over here. So what that did was sent the rest of the world into recession because we called in our notes. You know what I'm saying? It's time to pay the loan. And you guys can read the comments, and Worship Brother Moore's got some cool factual numbers that are on here. But, we just want to make sure that everyone understands the time frame. We're setting the stage for what was happening in Freemasonry at that time.
Right. And Brother Cole said, what comparison did the Depression have with what's going on now? We won't know until we get out of this. Because we don't know the numbers. I know we've lost some brethren, and we'll have to see what happens, but we won't know the full ramifications for probably a couple years until we start seeing folks that got suspended because they can't afford to pay their dues and this and that and other things that happen. It's going to be an after effect, and then after,
right?
And maybe in a year or so we can revisit some of this stuff and see how closely it correlates, because this is a worldwide phenomenon like that was.
And unfortunately for us, we'll be able to get some numbers will start trickling in the next year or so.
Right.
But we won't know the full ramifications 5-10 years from now.
Right.
When we look back and we analyze and take in the numbers and see what happens to our numbers, we won't really know. We'll have a just, and we'll be able to have a count, but to put it in perspective, until all the data comes in from all the other Grand Lodges around the world, we will not know what kind of adverse effect this has
it's just
on
like
us.
Yeah, just like 9/11. We think back to that. We're just now coming up with some of the final calculations than we have for the last few years. But here we are, 19 years after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still seeing some ripples from that and understanding some of the things that went on with that. So it's going to take some time before we have a grasp on what's going on now and how it affected Masonry.
And I really don't think that, unfortunately, I mean, it depends on how much longer we stay into this thing we're in now. I don't know that we'll ever see another 1929 depression.
Right.
I don't know if we'll ever hit that 5-year trend and stretch this out to now. Will we have residual effects from this? We'll have these residual effects for 10 years.
Absolutely.
This pandemic that's going on today in the world, we're going to have some kind of residuals come from that. There's no way around it. It's just what happens. This is a major world event. And do I think some things are getting blown out of proportion? Absolutely. But you err on the side of caution. I get it. But we have shut down economies in countries around the world. Stopped them. Not us personally, not America, but because of what we're doing, we always lead the way. Same thing we did back in the war efforts in the World War I, World War II, and so on. So
let me just kind of throw this out there. We've kind of alluded to it, but during the Great Depression, what was the most common cause for the reduction in members of Freemasonry at the time?
Well, of course, you know what it was.
We know what it was, but I want to see if anyone. And it's pretty easy to figure out when you think about it in the terms of what was going on back then. So, what was the reason most Masons were leaving Freemasonry or getting out of Freemasonry at the time?
Mm-hmm.
We'll just see what the community has to say here on our live stream. Again, thank you to all who have joined us this evening. We've got a great crowd tonight, and we could go on and on about this, but the Grand Lodge. I was looking up some information from the Grand Lodge of Missouri and other states, but in the 1930 Grand Lodge Proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Missouri, there was a quote made from the Grand Master's address, and I quote, "The losses are largely accounted for by suspension for non-payment of dues, and this I am satisfied is due to the general financial depression which exists at this time." So most of the outings of Freemasonry at the time, or the loss of membership, was due to folks not being able to pay their dues. And that was prevalent in Georgia, Missouri, Kansas, Illinois. I mean, you could go state to state through their Grand Lodge Proceedings and find this information, and it was the same.
And just think about this too. In Georgia at that time, there were 600 plus lodges. There was that for many years, and the talk of consolidations were at the head of the game at that time. Everybody was wanting to consolidate. In the 1934 proceedings, there was a resolution on the Grand Lodge floor at that time, which was voted on unanimously by the brethren, and the brother who introduced the resolution eventually withdrew it, but they did a unanimous a vote to roll back the per capita from $1.50 to back to $1. And back then, you know, you got to understand that the things we did in dues money, boy, it covered a lot of things back then, and the penny box was a serious note. So for those of you who are Masons will understand when I talk about the penny box. The penny box was used back then for the higher education fund, which is, we have something different now called the higher education fund. The penny box now goes to endowment or things like that. But understand that it was crazy.
Well, you also have to understand in today's terms, to put a little more perspective on it, $1 in 1929 today is worth $14.99.
Well, think about worse. Brother McKenna said that the power bill, his grandfather said, was 50 cents, and he didn't have 50 cents to pay the power bill.
So, yeah, I mean, you got to put this in perspective. These folks, I don't know what let me look up the minimum wage or the median wage in 1929, and that'll give you some perspective on, you know, it sounds like dollars and cents, but that's what they made back then, was small dollars and small cents. So it's kind of interesting to go back and see what these things were. And you got to put in this kind of perspective, because I know that when I talk about $1, I don't think about it hard.
That's right.
But it's just amazing. So the average price for a sirloin steak in 1929 was 41 cents.
That's the same steak that some of you will pay $100 for nowadays, if it's a good steak.
If it's a good steak.
So some other things that were going on that people don't realize is when the Depression hit. You know, the Roaring '20s were the second golden age of Masonic temple building. You know, the Great Temple in Detroit. Those of you who've not had the opportunity to visit the Masonic Temple in Detroit, it opened in 1926. There were 40,000 Masons in attendance, or 40,000 people in attendance. During the same time, there was a small memorial being built on, you know, up on Shooter's Hill in Alexandria, called the George Washington Masonic Memorial, and it cost $8 million to build this building. For those who've never been there, the place is so cool. It's got elevators that start out at like 35, 40 feet apart, and when you get to the top floor, they're virtually touching. During the Depression, the construction on the building continued, and it was opened in 1932.
Yeah. During the Depression. And every Grand Lodge in America, and probably the world at that time, was asked to contribute money to this thing. So it was dedicated to the father of our country. So that's where, I mean, some things didn't stop, but the golden age of temple building had stopped because of the Depression. Right. Well, just to give you guys some facts from the Grand Lodge of Georgia, going through the 1931 and 1934 books that you have, in 1931, the net membership loss here in Georgia was 3,724 folks. And the suspensions that year were 4,300.
So they were 60%.
Right. You know, there were 1,150 masters and past masters at the Grand Lodge session that year. Think about that.
1929 or 1931, huh?
1,100.
That's right.
And they, you know, it was tough to get to Macon probably at that point in time. Some of you probably have heard of one of these lodges, but Johnny Hill Lodge number 99, Poplar 537, which I don't think exists anymore.
No.
And Newborn 39, and Byramville 494. Their lodge rooms were destroyed by fire that year. Just kind of an interesting fact that, you know, not only did folks have to deal with the Depression and what was going on, there were also lodges that their rooms burnt or their buildings burnt that year. Imagine during this time having something like that happen to your lodge.
That's right.
You know, you just heard this morning on the news about the South Carolina Lodge.
Yeah, for those that don't know, is Hey Jazz Shrine Center in Greenville caught fire last night and significant damage. They don't know if it's a total loss or not. I hadn't heard this afternoon, but you know, our prayers go out to our brethren and nobles up in South Carolina that go to that temple. Do you know that Hey Jazz Shrine Center donated the last dollars to see that Greenville Shriners Hospital was open?
Yep.
So they're very impactful in that place.
That's a good point, Tom.
Yeah.
Also, during the Grand Lodge session that year, the Grand Lodge learned something very valuable in 1931.
Yeah, I'm sure it had to do with financing, didn't it?
Absolutely. Going through their financial books, they found out they were $43,350 in the red.
Wow.
Because the Grand Lodge was allowed to spend upcoming funds in the years that hadn't currently happened yet.
So they were prepaying. They were taking the prepayment of funding.
They were taking money out of the Social Security fund
Yeah.
and spending it before it ever got there. So during these years, the Grand Lodge actually cut some of their budgets, a lot of their budgets, to get themselves back in the red or back in the black, and they learned to quit spending that money before they had it in their hands. I mean, so it was a good lesson learned by our Grand Lodge at the time to not go out and say, hey, we've got money we're going to get next year, because this time and point, the decline was going on. People couldn't pay their dues. Lodges couldn't pay their dues. So now, where are we going to get this money from? So it was a very good lesson for not only the folks, but also our Grand Lodge at the time. You know, and lots, like you mentioned earlier, lots of small lodges, they actually consolidated during this time because the lodge couldn't afford to keep itself if it had 3 or 4 members afloat because they didn't have any money. So they would actually consolidate 2 or 3 lodges together and keep one lodge going, as opposed to, that's why we had over 600 lodges. Now we're down, right now we're under 400 in the state of Georgia, but it's because people started coming together and realizing they needed to pool their resources.
Some other things that happened. We got 394 lodges today, 30,989 Masons. That's down from 32,000. Yeah, that's a good point, Brother Cook. The Fox Theater closed only 125 weeks after it opened, and the Shriners lost that building during there.
You know, one of the really cool things I thought was coming out of the Great Depression, and you know, this should really touch every Mason's heart or anyone who's been to the Masonic Children's Home. Here's an interesting fact for you. We've got, maybe 30 kids or so down there now? Back in 1931, imagine this handful. They had 182 children at the home on average that year. You know, they always had some coming and going. And they figure they had with folks, with the kids they were helping offsite as well, they were taking care of over 200 kids in the year 1931. Think about that from the perspective. But, you know, back then the home was a lot more self-sustaining. They had farms, they grew their own food, they had a machine shop where they learned trades, they had a print shop where they did a lot of their own stuff. But think about 60 times the kids we've got now.
That's
or 6
right.
times the kids we got now.
That's right.
18.
And at one time it was well over 200.
Yeah.
And you know, some other cool things is most people don't know that in the late 20s, right before the Depression, the Masons in Georgia, they held a fundraiser and they built a cottage in Alto, Georgia. Most people don't know that Alto State Prison is up there, but there was a huge tuberculosis outbreak in the United States. But it was a massive outbreak. So the Masons in Georgia pulled together, and then they built this cottage up in Alto, and they donated it to the state.
That's pretty cool.
And there was a big thing in the legislature, and it's all in the proceedings of the book. Now here's some factual numbers that came out of that, from in 1929, there were 69,953 Masons in Georgia. Okay, that was on August 31, because the rolls had to be in, all the numbers had to be in by August 31. In August 31, 1934, there were 44,500 Masons. We lost 36% of our membership in 5 years.
And most of those, like we said, were probably from suspension for non-payment. I can't remember the year. You might be able to remember the year, but wasn't there a year in this where the Grand Lodge changed the suspension for non-payment from 1 year to 2 years, or 2 years to 1 year?
In 1931, they amended the code section. It was 205 back then, that said that a brother could be suspended for non-payment of dues after 12 months instead of 24. That was met with a huge approval. Also in 1931, this is for some of those who may be watching, that this will be relevant to, because of what we face now with a certain committee I may sit on with the Grand Lodge. General Welfare recommended that the Code Supplement Committee make sure that the code be brought up to date.
Well, and the reason in my mind that they had to change this code for suspension of non-payment is, the lodge, if they don't get the person off their rolls, they have to pay per capita.
Mm-hmm.
So every person that wasn't able to pay, that was still on the rolls because they couldn't suspend them due to this legislation of this code that was already in there at 24 months, now the lodge has to foot more money. Well, most of them couldn't afford it. So this was a good piece of legislation, in my opinion, because the lodges were financially hurting themselves.
But McCann, I know that at my lodge in the 1920s, all the way up through 35, the dues at my lodge were $4.50. That's at Beaufort, where I go to lodge. So if you do that math for today, $4.50, that's probably a pretty good amount. It's probably $500.
Probably.
I've been sitting here thinking about, Brother Cole has made some comments, and I'm trying to figure out how to answer them and how to answer them without it being just downright just wrong. But
$4, just while you're thinking about that, $4.50 in 1929 is equivalent to $67.47 according to a little calculator.
So that's $70 roughly today. But that's true. This TV would be black and white. But to Brother Cole's statement about trying to look into something about to help out our brothers and this and that and the other, the individual lodges, we have stressed since day one on this show, the individual lodges need to look in on its members. Mm-hmm. The individual lodges need to be there to show and support these brethren, especially those that are maybe battling this virus going on right now. Mm-hmm. We need to start there at home and try to see what we can do to take care of our people, because it's the lodge's responsibility to do so.
Well, just to make it feel like 1929, we're in black and white now.
Yeah, looks good. I like it. So, Brother Cole, I know that's a vague answer, and I know that's probably not what you wanted to hear from me, but there again, these things are our opinion. Mm-hmm. I'm just a firm believer that the individual lodges are responsible for taking care of their members. That's why you pay dues to that individual lodge, and that's why we're supposed to look in on our brother. I'm not saying we need to go out there and pay his light bill and things about that. I just think that all lodges, from what I know, lodges I've been associated with over time, and that the brethren will come to the aid of a brother in distress. There was a promise in there somewhere at some point, But what I'm saying is we want to make sure that our individual lodges take care of our members. We need to call them, look in on them. I have 2-3 members of my lodge that have this virus or possibly have this virus. We just found out about it today. We're trying to see what they may need. We don't know yet because they're still in the early stages. I just know that it's our responsibility as the members, as the brother, to look in on the brother.
Right, and I think part of what he's saying too is, what about those lodges that are struggling? Well, this boils back to what we talked about on our last episode. Lodges need to have that forward look to think about stuff like this. We went into this a little bit at length about what your dues should be for, and if the lodge doesn't have something in the bank where they can weather a storm of this nature, they need to rethink their financial situation.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's, I see Brother Garrison said maybe a plan B or C. Our forefathers thought ahead. We're stuck in the mud. You know what I'm saying? I know that sounds crazy, but it's the truth. Our lodges should be prepared for certain situations, and they're not. Financially, lodges have crippled themselves based on the fact that they didn't pre-plan. I've said it once, I've said it 5,000 times. People have heard it in meetings I've been in. We've sold masonry so cheap in Georgia that it's just like buying a Coke down the street. Yeah. So, we're not going to get in a long financial. We're talking about the depression, not this stuff, but those are some good points that they're making. But, what have individual lodges done out there to look in on their brethren? Not just a Zoom meeting for the officers, not just, what have you done to stay in contact with your people and see if anybody needs any assistance?
And I've heard of some lodges, just the officers getting together and having little Zoom meetings. Well, what about the rest of your brethren? Mm-hmm. I know our lodge, we get together as many as want to come to an open meeting on Wednesday nights, and we just chat. We don't necessarily do any lodges. We had to deal with our insurance, but besides that, we just get together to see each other. How many other lodges are doing that? I know there's a lot, but there's also some that just keep it to a little closed group to get together. And to me, that shuts you off as a lodge.
Absolutely. And you don't want to distance yourself from anybody. I mean, I'm fortunate. I get to talk to a lot of guys. You talk to a lot of guys. But overall, as a whole, what are we doing to keep in contact with these people, with our brethren, to see what they need? So, Brother Dixon, you are correct. It's not hard to suspend someone who has the money, but just too lazy to pay their dues. But in the Depression time, there was no money. People were starving to death. I did say, President Roosevelt was going to save them all. That's what the Alabama song was, Song of the South. But at that same time, there were things happening around the world at that time that people don't really realize. Adolf Hitler was coming into power in Germany. They were establishing the SS and the Gestapo and all those things. The Germans were so afraid of Masons and the power that they think that Masons had. They went through every country they went through and took over Poland and all the other countries that they were affecting, and dissolved the lodges, stole their assets, took their assets away from them, destroyed their histories. There were many artifacts found in old SS headquarters and things of that nature. I mean, we know how the Jewish people were persecuted during German reign. The Masons took the same kind of persecution purely based on the thought process that Masons were these all-powerful, could start a war at any time.
Well, and if you were a Mason back in Germany, you actually had to wear a special symbol on your outfit that let everyone know you were a Mason. Mm-hmm. So I mean, they were not just, their lodges weren't just destroyed and this kind of stuff. Everyone knew you were a Mason and you had identified as one. So it would have been scary back then to know that you were singled out just because you were a Mason. I can't imagine what anyone, the Jewish people that were put in the concentration camps, or the Masons that were done the same way, or anyone that was done like that over there during that time. I can't even fathom that. But it's just amazing what all happened during this time frame in history and how history does kind of repeat itself. We're seeing some of these same things with the financial situations today
Right.
that were going on 100 years ago, and how things just kind of tie together. And we didn't learn some of the lessons we should have with the Depression, because we didn't live during, a lot of us didn't live during, most of us didn't live during the Depression years.
You look like you've aged well.
Yeah, I've tried. But, you know, it all goes back to the same thing, what we talked about on the last cast, we talked about on several casts before. Take care of your brethren, take care of your lodge, and you've got to plan for the future, and not just in your lodge, but in your personal life, because if you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, a lot of these families that are hurting, a lot of these brethren that are hurting, because they didn't plan and they live paycheck to paycheck, because that's the kind of society we live in today. And it's something we all need to really learn from, and definitely teach our children and the generations behind us that, hey, you got to be prepared for this.
See, you know, you can't suspend anyone over 70 without investigation and report to the lodge. All MPDs should be investigated as required by code. You know, I don't know how most lodges are affected and what they're doing, but I know that June 30th is when the end of our year is, and if we were supposed to read our names and everything in May or in April, and then people will be suspended. It would, guys, I'm not telling you how to do your business, but what I am telling you is to really, really investigate any possibility of anyone that's got that hadn't paid their dues, that has traditionally paid their dues. You know what I'm saying? You look in on all members who have not paid their dues, but more especially those who have been paying, and now they can't. I talked about pride and what it does to a man, and how a man can't swallow his pride to ask for help. You know, we talk about what happens if lodges can't meet and lodges can't do this. Well, you know, as a lodge, you need to figure it out. Truthfully.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we have a master and a wardens and the membership to figure it out. You know, unfortunately, there's no hand-holding in this gig. So, you know, that's where we are. So,
well,
we're trying to figure out why we got this echo going on.
We haven't changed any settings, so hopefully it goes away on its own, because we're seeing no issues on this end. So please bear with us. We are very close to the end, so.
But anyway, I'm not going to talk anymore about that. I'll get on a soapbox, and I don't have my preaching cloth and all that stuff. But
well, brother, there's a ton of information out there on Freemasonry during the Great Depression. What was happening around the world in other jurisdictions. Go and search on Google. You'll be able to find proceedings from other lodges, and read through those proceedings, not just the Grand Master's address, but read through the proceedings front to back, because it's very good information. And a lot of lessons we can learn, and if we put them into practice, will definitely help us for the future. So, to wrap this up this evening, we've started doing quotes at the end. We like doing those quotes. So our first quote is from Leo Tolstoy, and Worship Brother Forrester over here will hit us up with that one.
It's going to fall in line with the conversation that we just had. It's funny how these things work themselves out. But Leo Tolstoy said, everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. You know, it's like when you're sitting there at work and you got all these people who complain about everything, but it's never their fault. It's because they fail to look in the mirror. So Tolstoy said it great when he made that comment.
Well, and then Nelson Mandela also made a great statement. Education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world.
Absolutely.
And, you know, if you think about it, it ties to the lesson, because when you educate yourself, you make yourself better. If you make yourself better, the world's going to get better.
So, I'm going to skip over the other one. I'm going to go to the Spanish proverb. And then we're going to throw in the Spanish proverb, and then we're going to talk about Mark Twain. So, a wise man
changes his mind, a fool never will. Spanish proverb.
True that.
True statement.
And then Mark Twain, of course, no amount of evidence will ever persuade an idiot. No amount. Buckets or a shovel or a truckload.
That's right. And of course, Maya Angelou said, if you can't change it, change your attitude. And brethren, all problems can be solved with a good attitude. I don't care how bad you are. Yeah. That's a quote from me. But anyway, we'd like to thank you guys again for spending time with us. We know, please remember our brethren when upon your bending knees, those that are sick and afflicted. Continue to pray for our Grand Master that he can make the good decisions, he and his Grand Lodge officers. Continue to pray for this country, the restart of it, how it gets back on its feet. You know, we don't know where it's over or not. We don't know. We don't know how things are trending. There's so many false numbers out there, and always remember, we love you, and nothing you can do about it. Nothing.
And just so everyone knows, spread this around to your friends. Thursday, we might have something special for you. But we're not going to tell anyone what's going on. You have to be there to know. So just wait and see, because we don't have our topic picked out yet, but we have a couple of good ideas in our head. But we got something special, and I think it's going to be fun.
Maybe.
No, maybe to it. It will be fun. So join us Thursday for something a little twisted.
Remember,
be excellent to each other. Good night.